Imam Qurtubi, whose full name was Muhammad bin Ahmad bin Abu Bakr, who was the famous 13th century scholar born in Muslim Spain, writes in his tafsir about the benefits and etiquettes of visiting the grave. He says that visiting the grave is a potent medicine for the one whose heart has become hardened and who has forgotten the hereafter. He mentions that the scholars have said that the person who wants to cure his heart, who wants to free himself from his subjugation to sins, and who wants to turn to the obedience of his Lord, should mention and remember death abundantly. And he describes death as something which extinguishes desires, separates the groups of friends, and orphan sons and daughters. He says he should also make a habit of calling upon the people, visiting the people who are between life and death, and he should also visit the graves of the Muslims. He says whoever does these three things, that will benefit his heart. But then he says that the person whose heart is really hard, has become so corroded by sin, just mentioning death won't benefit such a person that much. And also, mentioning death isn't the same as seeing it. So someone whose heart has gone past that point, he should instead try to visit those who are between life and death as much as possible, and see how these people are now, how they used to be, and how now they are on the verge of death. That should hopefully cure and soften his heart and reduce his desires for the world. But Imam Qurtubi then acknowledges that it's not always possible to visit such people. How many people do we know that are at that stage of their lives? And also, when one needs that cure, such people may not be around. But he says one thing that we can all do, and that's ever present, is visiting the graves of the Muslims. So one should try and do that more, as that's more easier. But when one does visit the graves of the Muslim, he should observe its etiquettes. He says that on the way there, your heart should be attentive. And when you arrive there, you should have the presence of heart. And recognize that you're not just here to walk around the graves. You're actually there for a purpose. Walking around the graves, you're no different to an animal that just passes by the graveyard. So as a human being, you should remember, and as a Muslim, that you're there for three reasons he mentions. The first is you're there for Allah's pleasure. Everything we do should be for Allah's pleasure, so we are there to get closer to Allah Ta'ala. Second reason we are there is to correct our hearts. So by remembering death and seeing the graves, that should hopefully correct our hearts. And the third intention is that we will go there and recite the Quran and supplicate for the deceased. And he mentioned reciting the Quran and supplicating near the grave as well. So this is evidence that the 13th century scholar recognized the importance of reciting the Quran near the graves. He then mentions that you should refrain from walking on top or sitting on the graves. So you should respect the deceased. And there are many hadiths that mention this, that paining or sitting on the grave is like paining the living. Imam Qurtubi says that when you enter the graveyard, say salam to all those. And then when you reach the grave of the one you're visiting or the one you recognize, say salam again to it. And then stand before the face of the deceased. He mentions because visiting it is like visiting the living, and speaking to it is like speaking to the living, and you would do that face to face, not from behind someone's head. So stand in front of the grave. And then when you're standing there, and he doesn't mention this, but I assume after you've supplicated, recited the Quran, then reflect upon the one who is now under the soil. Think about how now he's separated from his family and his friends. That he used to lead armies, he used to lead people, he used to be with people, but now he's on his own. He used to compete with his friends, he used to compete with others, he used to gather wealth. But then death arrived, he mentions, when he was not expecting, and came a horror he was not anticipating. So reflect upon the state of the person who has passed away. How much hopes did he have? How much wealth had he gathered? But now all those hopes have ended, and he didn't benefit from his wealth. The only wealth we benefit from is the one we use. What we leave behind is what we leave behind for others. So he gathered all that wealth, but left it all behind. And now reflect on how the soil has erased the beauty of his faces, how his bodily parts must now have disintegrated in the grave. The people he loved and cared for, his wives and his children, Now they have become widowed, and his children have become orphans, and all the excellent wealth he had gathered has now been divided up and taken by others. Remember all the endeavours he had, all the efforts he put in to reach his aims, to fulfill his mission, to meet his objectives, how he'd work hard for those, how he'd work hard to get the means to all those, how he tried to stay young and healthy, how he used to turn to that and realize that you've got those same inclinations and desires yourself, and reflect that just like the person deceased, one day your hopes and your desires and your aims will come to an end as well. And Imam Qurtubi says that what stands before you is a similar horrible death and a swift destruction. We will suffer the same fate as them. So remember that this person who worked hard, how his feet are now broken, how he used to enjoy seeing his friends, but his eyes have now dried up, how he would take on others with the power of his speech, but now the worms have eaten his tongue, how he used to laugh during happy times, but now the soil has eroded his teeth, and become convinced that your ending will be no different to his. So with all this remembrance and reflection, all your worldly bashfulness will decline, and you will start to pay attention to the deeds for the hereafter. You should then withdraw from the world and turn to the obedience of your Lord, and your heart, inshallah, will soften, and your body will become humble. May Allah Ta'ala keep us on the straight path.